It was supposed to be a fresh start. In 2022, the Carter family moved into an old Victorian home on the outskirts of Ridgefield, Pennsylvania, a quaint town where time seemed to linger in the corners of every cracked sidewalk and creaking floorboard. The house was a fixer-upper, yes, but it had charm, history, character, the kind of place where families were raised and memories made. That's what drew them in. They began renovations immediately, sanding floors, painting walls, and slowly breathing new life into forgotten rooms. It was during the demolition of the chimney that everything changed. Behind a loose brick near the base, tucked deep in the old masonry, was a small, aged envelope, dust-covered, yellowed, and sealed. It wasn't just debris, it was deliberate. The handwriting was childlike. On the front, in faded pencil, was a single name, Annalise. They opened it carefully. Inside was a letter. "If someone finds this, please tell my sister I didn't run away. He said I had to hide. I'm scared. I hear him downstairs at night, but I'm too afraid to come out. A." The Carters froze. The letter, dated October 3rd, 1954, was more than 60 years old. They took it to the local authorities, who immediately reopened a file that had long since faded into forgotten archives. The case of Annalise Hartwell, an 11-year-old girl who disappeared without a trace in the autumn of 1954. Back then, it had been a town-wide mystery. Posters were printed, doors were knocked, the woods were searched, and eventually the investigation was abandoned, labeled a likely runaway. But this letter, it changed everything. Because if Annalise hadn't run away, if she'd been hiding in the very house the Carters had just bought, then the case wasn't just unsolved. It had been misunderstood from the very beginning. This is the story of a girl who vanished in the shadow of a quiet town, a family haunted by decades of silence, and a letter sealed behind bricks that would finally unearth the truth. What happened to Annalise, and why did it take almost 70 years for her voice to be heard? On the morning of September 30th, 1954, the Hartwell family followed a routine that felt just like any other. Annalise, the youngest of two daughters, sat at the small breakfast table sipping watered-down orange juice, while her older sister, Margaret, braided her hair. Their mother, Eleanor, hurried between the stove and the hallway mirror, fixing her lipstick before heading to the fabric shop she managed downtown. Their father, Raymond, sat silently behind a newspaper, occasionally glancing up to remind the girls to hurry. They lived in a modest but respectable two-story home, the very home, decades later, the Carters would buy. Its rooms echoed with the normalcy of mid-century life. Piano practice, Sunday dinners, whispers of a world war recently past but not quite forgotten. Annalise was quiet, curious, and observant. She wasn't the kind of child to wander off or cause mischief. According to neighbors, she rarely played with others outside her sister. Margaret was her protector, more outgoing, slightly older, and fiercely loyal. That day, Annalise walked to school like usual. Her coat was too big for her, sleeves folded at the wrists. She carried a second-hand satchel and a pressed brown lunch bag tucked inside. Her last confirmed sighting was by Mrs. Emery, a widow who lived 2 doors down. "She waved at me from the sidewalk," Mrs. Emery told police, "just like she always did." But Annalise never made it to class. By noon, her teacher called home. By dusk, the town was searching. What followed was a methodical, determined search effort. Local law enforcement, aided by volunteer groups, canvassed every corner of Ridgefield. The woods behind the school were combed, rivers and creeks were dredged, flyers were posted on every telephone pole. The Hartwells offered a reward, meager but desperate. Newspapers printed her photo, a narrow face framed by thick curls, large eyes filled with cautious intelligence. The caption beneath read, "Have you seen Annalise?" People speculated. Some believed she had been taken by a drifter. Others thought she had run away. though no one could say why. Police questioned everyone. Neighbors, teachers, even her own family. "We thought maybe she had gone to meet someone," one detective noted in a later interview, but there was no indication of anything like that. Nothing about the case made sense. Her belongings were untouched. There was no sign of forced entry, no screams heard, no footprints or struggle, just nothing. Inside the Hartwell home, things fell apart quickly. Eleanor, who had always kept herself composed, began sleeping in Annalise's bed. Margaret stopped speaking entirely for weeks, and Raymond, a factory foreman known for his cold demeanor, withdrew completely. The police came by often in the early days, but as the weeks dragged on, their visits became less frequent. Eventually, the investigation slowed, then stalled. By late November, it was quietly reclassified. Runaway. Suspected voluntary absence. There was no evidence to say otherwise, no body, no trace, just an 11-year-old girl. Gone. The family's grief turned inward. Raymond went back to work and barely spoke at home. Eleanor became obsessed with checking the mail, convinced Annalise would write. Margaret, in her teenage years, would later describe it like living in a house where the walls themselves were mourning. It felt like everything held its breath and never let go. By 1956, 2 years after Annalise's disappearance, the Hartwells moved away. Rumors circulated about why. Some said they couldn't bear the memories, others whispered that they knew something they weren't saying. But Ridgefield moved on. The house was sold to a young couple. Then another. Time passed. The world changed, and Annalise became just another name on a long list of missing children. A faded photo in a dusty file, a cold case buried beneath layers of time and forgetting. Until the Carters found that letter. After Annalise's disappearance, her name slowly faded from daily conversation in Ridgefield, but it never left the minds of those who knew her, especially not her sister. Margaret Hartwell, then just 13, never quite recovered. For years, she refused to speak of that day, and when pressed by authorities or family friends, she would shake her head and repeat one chilling phrase. She didn't run. She was scared. But no one listened. As far as the police were concerned, the trail had gone cold. Margaret was labeled traumatized. Her words considered the reaction of a grieving child, not a witness. She later told a childhood friend that she heard whispers in the night after Annalise went missing. Creaks on the stairs, shuffling in the attic. But every time she spoke up, her father dismissed her, and her mother simply cried. By the time Margaret turned 16, she had moved in with an aunt out of state. Her parents never followed. The Hartwell family, once a picture of 1950s middle-class stability, fractured beyond repair. But Margaret never forgot. Meanwhile, in Ridgefield, life went on. The town slowly paved over the story, both figuratively and literally. The woods where volunteers had once searched were cleared for new homes. The elementary school where Annalise had been headed the day she vanished was rebuilt. Even the newspaper archive with her photo was eventually digitized, her name buried beneath newer tragedies. And the house, that same Victorian home, passed hands several times. It was, in many ways, a forgotten monument to a mystery no one believed would ever be solved. That is, until 2022. The Carter family had no idea what they were walking into. Kyle and Jenna Carter had moved from Philadelphia with their 2 children, excited to renovate the home and document the process on their growing YouTube renovation channel. They were no strangers to fixer-uppers, but this house felt different. From the moment they entered, there was something oddly preserved about it. An untouched attic, dusty closets filled with faded wallpaper and wooden toys, even a child's name, Annalise, etched faintly in pencil beneath an upstairs windowsill. They thought nothing of it. A relic from a former owner, maybe. It wasn't until Kyle began work on the chimney, planning to open it up and restore the original fireplace, that things took a turn. Removing the lower bricks near the foundation, he spotted something wedged deep behind the stone. A small, brittle envelope, sealed and yellowed with age. Jenna was filming at the time. Their video footage captures the exact moment they pulled it free, brushed off the dust, and realized what they had found. Inside was a note, scrawled in childlike handwriting. "My name is Annalise. If you find this, I didn't run away. I am in the house. Please tell my sister. Tell her I'm sorry I was too scared." Kyle and Jenna stopped filming. They called the police. Within hours, the Ridgefield Police Department had reopened the 1954 missing persons case. Detectives reviewed the letter, had it authenticated, and confirmed it had been hidden in the wall for decades. For the first time in nearly 70 years, Annalise Hartwell's name was back in circulation. Local media seized the story. National outlets picked it up days later. "Renovation uncovers letter from missing girl," the headlines read. Social media exploded with amateur sleuths dissecting the Carters' footage frame by frame. Margaret, now in her 80s and living in New Hampshire, received a call from local authorities, and later a copy of the letter itself. When she read it, she wept. "I always knew," she told the officer quietly. "I just didn't know where to find her." The letter changed everything, because it meant someone had known all along that Annalise never left the house, that she hadn't run away, that someone, or something, had kept her hidden. The investigation was no longer theoretical. It was personal, urgent. And now, with new leads and a tangible piece of evidence, the police would begin to re-examine everything, including the house itself. When a case goes cold, time doesn't just pass. It buries. It buries memories under new traumas, evidence under bureaucracy, and truth under decades of disinterest. That's what happened with Annalise Hartwell. In the fall of 1954, once the initial search efforts were exhausted, the Ridgefield Police Department had few answers and even fewer leads. They filed Annalise under runaway non-criminal, a classification that, even at the time, felt like a way to close a door too painful to leave open. The records from that era were handwritten, thin, and speculative. One detective's note read, "No indication of forced entry. Likely voluntary departure. Age 11. Potential domestic friction mentioned by older sibling." But domestic friction was never followed up. No social workers were dispatched. No interviews with extended family were recorded. And as Ridgefield was still a relatively small conservative town in the 50s, few were willing to suggest the unthinkable, that something might have happened inside the Hartwell home itself. The public attention gradually waned. After 2 months, there were no more organized searches. By the new year, the case had been quietly boxed and filed. In the early 1960s, during a mass archive reorganization, Annalise's case file was physically misplaced for nearly a decade. By the time it was rediscovered and refiled in 1971, most of the original officers involved in her disappearance had retired, moved, or passed away. Margaret, now in her early 30s, had tried on several occasions to have the case revisited. But by then, she had left the state, changed her name, and started a new life far away from Ridgefield. Her calls to the police department were logged, but went nowhere. "It's been too long," she remembered being told. "We don't have anything to go on." Worse, when she mentioned things she recalled from her childhood, like sounds in the attic, or that her father had become increasingly controlling and erratic in the months before Annalise vanished, they were dismissed as unreliable memories from a grieving sibling. There were, however, moments when the case almost resurfaced. In 1984, a man cleaning out a storm drain reported finding what he believed to be a child's shoe with initials scratched on the sole, A.H. But the size and style didn't match what Annalise was last seen wearing. The lead was closed. In 1996, a local journalist working on a piece about Ridgefield's unsolved mysteries found an old article about Annalise and attempted to locate her family. He reached out to the town clerk's office and even tracked down Margaret's last known address, but got no response. "The trail ends cold," he wrote in his notebook. "A town that forgot, or chose to." Meanwhile, the house that once held the Hartwell family quietly absorbed new owners. Some reported strange noises, particularly from the chimney or attic. One couple claimed their dog would growl at the hallway leading to the basement, refusing to go near it. But without any historical context, these moments were written off as quirks of an old house. Until 2002, when a structural engineer inspecting the home before a sale noticed something strange. One of the support beams behind the wall near the chimney had been reinforced with newer wood. He flagged it in his report. Non-original crossbeam behind masonry. Installed approximately mid-century. Unclear purpose. No one thought to look deeper. Back in New Hampshire, Margaret, still carrying the weight of her sister's disappearance, had begun writing her own personal account of what happened. Not for the public, for herself. She described a man her parents often hosted in 1954, a co-worker of Raymond's, quiet, pale, with a lingering cough and an affinity for whiskey. She didn't know his name, just that he always seemed to be there when her father wasn't. And one night, she remembered hearing her father whispering through the heating vent, "She won't be a problem anymore." It made no sense to her then. She chalked it up to fear. But as an adult, replaying that night over and over again, the sentence took on a far more sinister weight. Margaret would later say, "I never stopped feeling her in that house. I just didn't know if it was a memory or a haunting." After the letter surfaced in 2022, the cold years finally began to thaw. Detectives reopened the case, this time with new technology, new eyes, and a sense of justice long overdue. They reached out to historical preservationists, forensic analysts, and cold case consultants to re-examine the property. A full structural review of the home was ordered, this time with legal warrants and ground-penetrating radar. They also contacted Margaret. She agreed to speak to investigators under one condition. "You search that house like it's still alive, because something was breathing inside those walls." The first time Ridgefield authorities walked back into the old Hartwell home with forensic specialists in 2022, they weren't there as guests. They were there as historians, detectives, and, for some, as believers. They brought with them new tools, decades more scientific advancement, and something the original investigation never had, a reason to believe Annalise never left the house at all. The first place they searched was the chimney. The letter had been found buried behind the lower brickwork, suggesting not only that Annalise was still in the house after she vanished, but that she had access to materials to write and the presence of mind to ask for help. It meant she was hiding, and it meant she was afraid of someone inside. Behind the chimney wall, ground-penetrating radar revealed something the home inspectors had never caught: an irregular void between the studs, a space about 3 feet wide and 6 feet tall, nestled deep behind layers of brick and insulation. The team removed the bricks layer by layer. Behind it, they found a narrow crawl space. Inside, faint traces of fabric, shredded paper, and the remnants of an old rusted tin lunchbox. On the inner wall, in nearly invisible pencil scratches, was a date: October 1st, the day after Annalise disappeared. Investigators were shaken. No remains were found, but it was clear this had been more than a structural anomaly. It was a hiding place, and it confirmed what the letter hinted at, that Annalise may have hidden inside her own home for days, maybe longer, and someone had known. While the forensic investigation unfolded, detectives also began building a psychological profile, not of Annalise, but of Raymond Hartwell. It turned out he had left Ridgefield just months after the family moved away, taking a factory job across the state line in New Jersey. In 1961, he was investigated for suspected abuse of a minor at a different residence. No charges were filed due to lack of evidence, and the report was quietly closed. More unsettling still, 2 years before Annalise vanished, a teacher had submitted a school report stating Annalise often appeared withdrawn and startled in class. The report mentioned bruises frequently visible on her forearms and legs. At the time, the report never left the school district office. It wasn't shared with law enforcement. It had sat, collecting dust, for nearly 70 years. Margaret was asked about her father again. Her words were measured, but firm. "He had secrets," she said. "We all knew, but we lived in a time when secrets were locked inside brick walls, and daughters were told to be quiet." The media attention reached a peak. True crime podcasters, YouTubers, and journalists all began revisiting Ridgefield's most haunting cold case. Comment sections filled with speculation. Was Annalise murdered? Was she starved? Did someone lock her in and forget? But those closest to the case knew the answer wasn't simple. They returned to the letter, the only thing truly written in Annalise's voice. "He said I had to hide. I'm scared. I hear him downstairs at night." The he remained unclear. Could it have been her father? That same co-worker Margaret once mentioned, or someone else entirely? Police attempted to run DNA testing on the scraps found in the crawlspace, but degradation and contamination over time left results inconclusive. No human remains, no blood evidence, no fingerprints, just scraps of a forgotten life buried in a house no one wanted to question. Despite the absence of a body, investigators reclassified the case from a missing person to a presumed homicide. It was a symbolic move, but a powerful one. It meant that Ridgefield finally, after nearly 7 decades, acknowledged that a crime had likely taken place. For Margaret, it was a hollow vindication. She wasn't looking for headlines or viral sympathy. She only wanted her sister's truth returned to the world, piece by piece. She was never lost, she told a local reporter. She was silenced. One more discovery shocked the investigators. While scanning archived property records, a cold case detective noticed that the Hartwell house had been briefly off-market in 1955 for what was listed as a foundation modification. Building permits from that time revealed a contractor's receipt for masonry work around the chimney, ordered and paid for in cash by one Raymond Hartwell. This matched precisely with the timeline suggested by the letter. The implication was chilling. The space Annalise had been hiding in may have been sealed intentionally. And if so, by whom? Raymond Hartwell passed away in 1982. He was never interviewed again after the initial 1954 disappearance. With Margaret's cooperation, investigators held a public memorial service for Annalise in Ridgefield in early 2023. Hundreds attended, many holding candles. The Carters, the family who found the letter, stood beside Margaret in silence as her sister's name echoed once more through the town square. After the service, Margaret released a final statement. She wasn't a ghost, she was a girl who needed help, and now she can rest. And for the town of Ridgefield, the letter in the wall was no longer just a relic of the past. It was a reckoning, a reminder that sometimes the most haunting mysteries don't hide in forests or basements, but right in front of us, waiting for someone to finally listen. The letter had opened the door. But it was what came next that truly shattered the silence. After the memorial and media firestorm died down, the Ridgefield Police Department quietly assembled a multi-agency task force to investigate whether any living individuals could still be held accountable for Annalise's disappearance. Though the most likely suspect, her father, Raymond Hartwell, was long deceased, the phrasing of the letter and hints uncovered during the investigation suggested she may not have been alone during her final days. The question that kept resurfacing was chilling in its implications. Who was he? In the weeks that followed, one of the cold case investigators, Detective Maria Santos, began examining old utility records and real estate documents connected to the Hartwell family. She was looking for anomalies, anything that might explain who else had regular access to the home back in 1954. What she found raised eyebrows. During the summer leading up to Annalise's disappearance, a man named Walter Fenn, listed as a repair technician, had made frequent service visits to the Hartwell residence. He was hired through a local hardware store where he'd worked as a freelance handyman and chimney specialist. Walter, it turned out, had also been listed as an emergency contact on the house's original electrical service form. Despite not being a relative, that was unusual. Unusual enough for Detective Santos to dig further. Walter Fenn had lived just 2 blocks away from the Hartwells at the time. A bachelor in his late 30s, described in police notes as quiet, punctual, and rarely social. Walter had been questioned briefly during the original 1954 investigation, but only to confirm he'd completed minor repairs at the house that summer. His involvement was never seriously considered, but Santos kept digging. She found that in 1957, Walter abruptly left Ridgefield and relocated to Wisconsin. There, he lived under a new name, Walter Frederick, and worked for another 40 years as a maintenance supervisor at a public school. He passed away in 2001, never once re-entering Ridgefield. What raised red flags wasn't his departure. It was the fact that he had changed his legal name. When Santos traced his estate, she found something no one had expected. Stored in a cedar chest in the attic of Walter's former Wisconsin home were a collection of old, yellowing letters, most of them receipts, sketches, and floor plans. But one envelope stood out. Inside it was a note, written in a handwriting remarkably similar to the one found behind the Hartwell chimney. It read, "I wanted to tell someone, but I didn't know how. He said he was fixing the wall. He told me I would be safe if I stayed quiet. But I don't want to be here anymore. Please tell my sister. Tell her I miss her." No name, no address. But when handwriting experts compared it to the original chimney letter from 2022, they found a 97% match. It was Annalise's. That meant she had written more than one letter. And somehow, Walter had one. The revelation triggered an avalanche of new questions. Had Walter sealed her inside the chimney? Had he been complicit, or worse, directly responsible? If so, why had he saved a letter? Had he planned to release it? Did guilt stop him? Or was it something darker, proof kept as a trophy? The letter's existence suggested Walter had access to the hiding space after Annalise wrote her message, which meant he likely knew where she was. And yet, he never told a soul. With Walter now dead, prosecution was impossible. But morally? Emotionally? The community was stunned. Margaret was informed immediately. She was silent for several minutes after hearing the news. When she finally spoke, her voice cracked. "I knew she had been trapped," she whispered. "I didn't know someone else had trapped her there." She was given a copy of the second letter. She held it for a long time before placing it inside her purse. She later told a reporter, "It was like hearing her breathe one more time." Detective Santos traveled to Wisconsin herself to inspect Walter's former home. Nothing else was recovered, but interviews with former neighbors painted a strange picture of the man. He was punctual, polite, quiet, always fixed things, rarely spoke about his past. One neighbor recalled, vaguely, that Walter once mentioned working in an old brick house back east when he was young. She remembered him saying, "Old homes keep their secrets. It's better not to open them." At the time, no one thought much of it. Now, they saw it for what it was, a warning or a confession. Back in Ridgefield, detectives returned once more to the house. This time, their focus was the attic. If Annalise had been able to move about, or if someone had relocated her while still alive, The attic would have been the only discrete space large enough to serve as a secondary holding area. Using thermal scanners and infrared, they discovered a false panel behind one of the walls. Inside was nothing but dust and bones of small animals, but one thing caught their attention: a hair ribbon. It was blue, faded, and pinned with a tiny silver clasp. Margaret confirmed in a heartbeat. That was hers. It didn't prove what happened, but it confirmed where she had been, and it matched the timeline suggested by the letter. Annalise had been hiding, not for hours, not for days, for weeks. With the discovery of the second letter and the hair ribbon in the attic, investigators now had the clearest timeline they'd ever seen for Annalise's final days. She had likely been confined, not just hidden, moved from one part of the house to another, writing letters she hoped would be found, trusting someone who ultimately chose silence over rescue. Detective Maria Santos stood in the attic doorway on a late November afternoon, the fading sun casting a long golden line across the old floorboards. The ribbon had been carefully placed, almost ceremoniously, on a support beam. There was no dust beneath it, which meant it hadn't been there long. Someone had once returned, years after the disappearance, to leave it behind. Who and why? They had no DNA from the ribbon. The last traces of time had consumed it. But the question still lingered. Could Walter have visited the house again after the Hartwells moved? Did someone else know she was there? And most disturbing of all, did anyone else help cover it up? Back in town, the revelation rocked Ridgefield. An op-ed appeared in the local paper titled, "The Girl in the Walls." It asked pointed questions about how a missing child could be left inside a house for decades without intervention, and why so many warnings, Margaret's especially, had been ignored. Some residents expressed anger, others, guilt. A few claimed they'd always suspected something was off about the house. The Carters, still living in the home, made the decision to temporarily move out. Their once upbeat renovation channel was now a place of mourning, their inbox flooded with questions, condolences, and conspiracy theories. "We bought a house," Jenna Carter said in a video statement, "and found a secret it never meant to give up. And now, we want that secret to speak for itself." The Carters donated the YouTube ad revenue from the letter video to a missing children's advocacy group, but their role in the story was just beginning, because shortly after moving out, they returned with one more discovery. During a final walkthrough with the restoration team, Kyle noticed a loose panel near the basement furnace. It was oddly placed, almost decorative, and covered in layers of paint. When they pried it off, behind it was a narrow, forgotten alcove. Inside was a child's drawing. It was primitive, made with crayon. A stick figure with curly hair, standing beside a tall, square shape, likely the fireplace. Next to the figure was a man, drawn all in black, holding what looked like a hammer. Below the picture were two words, misspelled but unmistakable: "Hide here." It was chilling, not because of the drawing itself, but because of what it suggested. Annalise was instructed or forced to hide. This wasn't just a case of a child running from abuse. This was entrapment, coercion, possibly something much darker. Investigators brought in a child psychologist to interpret the drawing. She concluded the black figure was likely an authority figure, possibly someone Annalise knew and feared. The hammer indicated construction, which matched the timeline of the chimney renovation Raymond had paid for just after her disappearance. The interpretation was damning. "She wasn't hiding from a stranger," the psychologist said. "She was hiding from someone she had to see every day. And if Walter Fenn had been involved, that meant two men might have had knowledge of her confinement. But no one had ever charged them. And now, no one could. For Margaret, every new discovery was a wound reopened. She gave one final interview on camera, surrounded by her grandchildren. Her voice was soft, but her words were unwavering. He told her to hide, maybe to keep her from talking, maybe worse. I don't know. But I know she trusted him, and I know he let her die alone in the dark. When asked what justice would look like now, she said, "Justice? There's no justice. There's only telling the truth and hoping it's loud enough that no other child gets buried behind bricks ever again." The town of Ridgefield installed a plaque near the local elementary school honoring the memory of Annalise Hartwell. It reads, "In remembrance of the voices that were never heard and the truths we must never stop seeking, forensic architecture teams are now studying the Hartwell home as a case study in structural concealment. It's being cited in law enforcement seminars as an example of how domestic crimes can hide in plain sight, especially in an era where authority was rarely questioned. The home's future remains uncertain. Some say it should be demolished. Others want it preserved as a museum. But one thing is certain: the silence is broken. Annalise's story, nearly 70 years buried, had finally been unearthed, not with a grave, but with a letter, not by a detective, but by chance. A girl who disappeared without a trace had left behind just enough to be found, and it was enough. After nearly 7 decades of unanswered questions, Annalise Hartwell's name was no longer whispered with speculation, but spoken aloud with recognition, sorrow, and a strange kind of relief. Her face, reconstructed from photographs, described lovingly by her sister, and remembered by the town's oldest residents, now stood for something more than a missing child poster. She became a symbol of how easily silence can take root, and how difficult but essential it is to unearth the truth. The letter changed everything. But in its wake came something unexpected, a shift in how Ridgefield understood itself. The town had long been defined by its traditions, quiet streets, closed doors, and respect for authority. But in the aftermath of the rediscovery, those same values were being reconsidered. How many other stories had been ignored? How many other children's voices had gone unheard? For the Carter family, the experience had transformed them. Their move into the old Victorian home had begun as a YouTube renovation project, paint swatches, mold inspections, and a dream of turning an aging property into a forever home. But now they felt like caretakers of history. They decided to donate part of their property, specifically the crawl space and attic section where items had been found, to a local historical preservation society. It would be maintained as a permanent educational exhibit, open once a year for guided tours about child protection, cold cases, and the evolution of domestic investigations. "We didn't want to just leave it behind," Jenna said during a town hall forum. "We wanted it to mean something." Margaret, now in her late 70s, continued to live a quiet life, but she returned to Ridgefield more frequently after the case was reopened. She was no longer the only one carrying the weight of what had happened. Others carried it now, too. She began working with victims' advocacy groups, helping families whose cases had gone cold. Her insight was valued not just as a survivor of trauma, but as someone who had fought for decades to be believed. "When people tell you it's too late, don't listen," she told a group of young volunteers. "Time only buries the truth if we let it." Margaret also published a short memoir titled The Girl Behind the Wall. It wasn't a bestseller. That wasn't the point. It was a way to tell her sister's story in her own words, to reclaim the narrative. Meanwhile, the Ridgefield Police Department created a new division focused on historical case reviews. Funded by grants and inspired directly by the Hartwell investigation, the unit was tasked with reopening unsolved disappearances with new forensic methods and community outreach. Detective Maria Santos was appointed to lead it. She said in a press conference, "Annalise taught us that sometimes justice comes not in handcuffs, but in remembrance, in refusing to forget." Their first case after Annalise's was another girl, vanished in 1963 from a neighboring town, her case long since presumed abandoned. Within months, New leads were uncovered. Annalise had sparked a movement. On a crisp October morning, nearly a year to the day after the letter was discovered, the town held a second candlelight vigil. This time it wasn't about mourning, it was about honoring. Dozens gathered outside the Carter home, now referred to locally as Annalise's house. There were no speeches, just candles and silence, and then, finally, the sound of a young girl playing the violin. Margaret stood at the back. Her hands trembled, but her face was calm. She later said, "It felt like she was there, not in the walls, not in the bricks, but finally free." The story of Annalise Hartwell didn't fade once the news cycle turned over. Instead, it deepened, woven into the consciousness of a community, then echoed far beyond it. Within a year of the case's public revelation, universities were referencing it in courses on forensic psychology, architecture, and law. Advocacy groups cited it as a case study on institutional silence and generational trauma. But the most powerful shifts weren't academic or procedural. They were personal. Jenna Carter started receiving hundreds of letters from viewers of their channel, including people who had lived through similar traumas, women and men who had suffered abuse in silence, who had once hidden, physically or emotionally, and never been believed. Many said they had spent their lives wondering if anyone would ever hear their story. "She gave me courage," one handwritten letter read. "If a girl in 1954 could try to speak from inside a wall, then maybe I can speak now." Some wrote poems, others sent pictures of childhood homes, places they now viewed with different eyes. Jenna and Kyle read every one. They decided to create a scholarship fund in Annalise's name to support survivors of child abuse, pursuing education in counseling or criminal justice. The fund's motto was taken directly from the letter Annalise wrote. "Please tell my sister. Tell her I'm sorry I was too scared." Back in Ridgefield, something else began to happen. Children started asking about her, not just from morbid curiosity, but from genuine concern. They wanted to know who Annalise was, what happened to her, and, most importantly, how to make sure it didn't happen to anyone else. Teachers began incorporating Annalise's story into safety programs. Community centers launched listening sessions where kids could anonymously report concerns. Local contractors, inspired by the investigation, created protocols for identifying suspicious structures during home renovations, reporting to law enforcement if any hidden rooms, sealed spaces, or unregistered architectural features were found. In her own quiet way, Annalise had become a guardian of others. Margaret's health began to decline shortly after the second memorial, but her clarity never wavered. She spent her final months surrounded by her children and grandchildren, often reading them letters from Annalise or sharing her memories of their simpler times before fear had entered the walls of their home. In one of her last interviews, she said, "I lived long enough to know she wasn't forgotten. That's more than I ever thought I'd get." Margaret passed away peacefully the following spring. She was buried beside her husband, but her headstone bore a line she'd requested long ago, etched clearly beneath her name. Sister of Annalise, witness, voice. The Carter family eventually returned to their home, choosing to keep the upper floors closed to the public, but preserving the attic and fireplace area in its original state. They no longer filmed renovations. Instead, they hosted private tours for schools and survivors groups. One young visitor, a 12-year-old girl named Ellie, asked Kyle during one tour, "Do you think she knew someone would find her?" He paused for a long moment. Then he said, "I think she hoped someone would listen." And someone finally did. And that became the legacy of Annalise Hartwell. Not a tragic mystery buried in brick, but a whisper that grew louder with time. A girl who vanished in 1954, but who left behind just enough to be heard across generations. A letter, a ribbon, a drawing, and a story that reminded the world. Even silence leaves evidence, if we're willing to look for it. Some stories stay with us, not because of the violence or the mystery, but because of the quiet persistence of truth. Annalise Hartwell's disappearance was once just a footnote in a dusty file, a date, a missing child, a line crossed out and forgotten, but she refused to be erased. In a time when children had no voice, she found a way to speak, not loudly, not with force, but through the only tools she had, a pencil, a scrap of paper, and a hidden space where she waited for someone to find her. That letter, tucked behind bricks for nearly 70 years, became more than just evidence. It became her voice, her legacy, and it changed lives far beyond the walls that once held her. The truth didn't come overnight. It didn't come with sirens or courtrooms or breaking news bulletins. It came slowly, painfully, piece by piece, through forgotten receipts, stained ribbons, old crawl spaces, and people willing to dig deeper when everyone else had stopped. And maybe that's the real message here, that justice isn't always swift, that some stories take decades to tell, but when they are finally told, they can echo louder than any verdict, lasting longer than any headline. Annalise wasn't just a girl lost to time. She was a daughter, a sister, a child who deserved better. And through her words, through the courage it took to write that final message, she became a beacon for others like her. So tonight, as you sit wherever you are, on your couch, behind your screen, maybe in a quiet room, ask yourself this: what would you have done if you had heard her knocking from the other side of the wall? Would you have listened? Would you have believed her? Would you believe someone now? Because the walls may be silent, but the stories inside them never are. And maybe the next time we hear a whisper, we won't wait 70 years to answer. If this story moved you, let us know your thoughts in the comments. If you know someone who's gone unheard for too long, listen. Share their name, share their story, and if you want more stories like this, real lives, real mysteries, and the truths time tried to bury, make sure to like, subscribe, and join us next time. Because sometimes the past is just waiting for someone to knock. Thank you for watching.